I was reminded of the research that documents empirically that the average adult listening to the averagely boring presentation hears about half of what it said, then understands about half of what he hears, then believes about half of what he understands, and he finally remembers about half of what he believes. So I concluded very quickly that I have about 3.5 good minutes to be audible, understandable, believable, let alone memorable. But I'm going to be using a good deal of my 3.5 good minutes, which actually gives me good time if I use 3 minutes to get to the airport, to focus on this remarkable capacity and be preceded by Peter Fonagy, who really is the intellectual force behind this mentalizing movement. So I'm going to use my 3 minutes to introduce mentalizing and its application to understanding and treating children and adolescents with emerging personality disorders, particularly those with antisocial narcissistic difficulties. So I'm going to be talking about this capacity that I will propose to you really underlies how we humans hear one another and understand one another and believe or trust in one another, and then by enabling us to trust in one another provides us with the key that makes possible that we learn from one another, and then that we remember what we learn and that we apply it more generally. So the way this key works is by opening the understanding of human behavior, our behavior as well as the behavior of others, as based on this activity that we can observe, human behavior, as based on, because by, an invisible activity, something that we cannot really observe, which is mental states, intentional mental states, such as thoughts and feelings and wishes and needs and goals, misconceptions, delusions, that we can access, and this is how the key works, by deploying the skills that are involved in two activities of our own. One is grasping automatically, intuitively, those mental states. And secondly, interpreting in a more controlled and reflective way. So remember, grasping and interpreting mental states that make human behavior, our own and that of others, meaningful, intentional, and therefore somewhat predictable, and therefore something that we can potentially influence with our own intentionality, with our own communication. So I'm speaking here about really the key to what makes us human, the key to our subjectivity and the subjectivity of others, a key that opens the door to the tools with which we construct a sense of ourselves, a sense of self, with some coherence, with some continuity, with agency, with ownership of our own behavior. And the key to open the skills that are involved in engaging in effective reciprocal relations with other humans. Key that when it breaks down, when it doesn't work, turns our internal world, as Lindsay, this 16-year-old girl, would say, into as scary a place as the world of human relationships. Key whose breakdown we will be proposing is really the central feature in shaping the developmental trajectory that leads to the emergence of dramatic personality disorders in adolescents, including the borderline, the narcissistic, and the antisocial aggressive kids. Now, to flesh out this developmental trajectory, this is not a picture of the clinic where I work, although it sometimes feels like that. It is meant to illustrate that developmental trajectory of those youngsters whose development makes us wonder where their lives are going to be consumed in the fire of the moment, taking a few of us with them in the destruction, before or after the course of their development leads them down the precipice. So to give you a somewhat more visceral and concrete sense of that burning house, let me give you one example, one vignette. So we're going to call this boy Joe. And Joe was from every retrospective account that we had, and we had many, was from the very beginning an extraordinarily sensitive and intensely reactive baby. It reacted with enormous intensity and a very negative, angry mood to minor frustrations, disappointments, and little not matching him and his mood. Reacted very intensely to that. And his gigantic tantrums were tremendously disorganizing for his mother, who will get very upset and will need to make it stop. She found a way to protect herself and the baby by locking herself in the bathroom and then turning on the shower so the sound of the water will muffle the crying of the baby. Until one occasion in which the escape route didn't work, and she found herself pressing a pillow over the baby's face in a semi-dissociated state from which she sort of snapped and said, "Oh my God," and stopped. So she didn't kill him, but went on to look for better ways to avoid being around him and left him much under the care of an alcoholic father who would often abuse him physically and sometimes sexually. Until the father was the boy was about 7, at which point the father left. And Joe was left to kind of roam the streets, engaged in some kind of delinquency, fights, some shoplifting, some stealing. He discovered when he was 9 alcohol and marijuana and cocaine. By the time he reached puberty, he discovered that cutting himself not only felt really good in a kind of strange way. It was not just very cool, as they say in America, but also gave relief to the unbearable feeling of feeling nothing. After a questionable suicide attempt, it's not clear whether that overdose was an accident or whether he really was trying to kill himself. he ended up being my patient. So I'm seeing him in psychotherapy, and when we met, the first thing he wanted to know is if I'm a faggot, which I believe you say something like, are you a maricas? Something like that. Thank you, Tao, for the translation. So we spent some time going about discussing the relative merits of how much we should get into my particular sexual orientation. And we got past that. And I swear to you, I was my mentalizing best with him. I was engaged, I was respectful, I was curious, I really wanted to understand what goes on in his mind. I was tolerant of not knowing really what he had in his mind, so I was always checking with him, did I really get this right? Which he experienced as an unbearable intrusion. He said, you stupid. Tiago didn't know how to translate shrink. He called me stupid shrink, which is a derogatory term for mental health professionals in the United States. It's somebody who shrinks people's brains. So I said, you stupid shrink, you think that you can read my mind? I said, no, that's why I'm checking with you. I really want to know. And after about 4 weeks of that, it kind of hit me, and I told him, oh, Joe, I think I got it. Tell me if I'm right, that if you're ever going to share what you got in your mind is when it makes sense to you, and not like a minute before that. And I wish I could tell you that he said, oh, Bleiberg, you are so empathic. But if I remember correctly, he invited me instead to engage in some kind of unnatural sexual activity with myself. And yet, in spite of himself, he almost grew to like me, which seemed to have produced a perhaps predictable crisis. The moment that he started thinking that maybe there was something in it for him to come to see me. So he resolved this crisis in one memorable session by telling me that I'm fucking headed with you, stupid shrink, and that he was going to run away and say, I can find where you live. He was going to find my house, and he was going to burn it to the ground, but only after raping my wife and murdering my children with intravenous injections of cocaine. A statement that I have to tell you tends to evoke a certain amount of countertransference, and it's not exactly conducive to optimal mentalizing. So keep this little vignette kind of in the back, just to kind of as a background to the discussion, in which I'm going to try to, before I have to run to the airport, unpack mentalizing. Stop working. I'm going to try to unpack mentalizing, and in its developmental context, in its developmental attachment context, I'm going to discuss the basic vulnerability that we humans share, the basic narcissistic vulnerability that we all humans share, having evolved to survive based on attachment and on a social context, and the role of mentalizing and trust in responding adaptively or maladaptively to such vulnerability. And then very quickly I'm going to review the principles of mentalizing-based treatment and the bargain that is involved when we invite people to trade automatic, non-mentalizing, coercive defensiveness for mentalizing and trust and learning. So Peter Fonagy's schema here, this is Peter Fonagy, that's Peter Fonagy. this schema kind of gets a bit into that unpacking of mentalizing in attachment, building on the work of Bowlby, who anticipated the notion that, that attachment evolved as a genetically prepared, as a procedural, that is, genes that are evolved to expect an epigenetic signal that activates them. So experience expectant genes, genes that regulate the evocation of this pattern of physiology and affect and movement, that is attachment, activated by fear, activated by cues, by stimuli coming from the outside world, like a loud noise that may signal the roar of a tiger, or from inside ourselves, like the drop of sugar in our bloodstream. Cues that have evolved to be encoded as signals of threats to the survival of the self. And these threats to the survival of the self activate this pattern of physiology, of movement, of signaling that has been conserved because it serves as a signal. It sounds like that has been conserved because it evokes a matching, protective, regulating response from somebody, from a caretaker, response that calms down regulates this aroused brain and eliminates the threat to survival. So this association of attachment and survival mediated by a social response, privileged attachment, to turn into the epigenetic context, the context that activates the transformation of what is an automatic response to others, and a response that is procedural, that is affect and movement and perception, into a flexible, goal, context, meaning-dependent, controlled response that is based on the capacity to represent affect, to control effortfully the deployment of attention, and on mentalizing. So the nature of attachment, indeed, that this pattern that is triggered by threats to the survival of the self that evokes that safe haven, that response that down-regulates the brain and eliminates the threat to survival. So it is perhaps the first step in this transformation from automatic to controlled. Involves this disposition that infancy researchers like George Gergely demonstrated in showing that normal babies are powerfully disposed. They are powerfully prepared to detect and to seek out the relationship between their signal, between the and the social outcome of that signal. The response that goes, "Oh, honey, you're so hungry." By being able to detect and to seek out a match. See, a match in time is what Gergely called the contingency. That is, that my signal precedes the outcome, the response. and that outcome is only followed by my signal. So it's my signal in time that is causing that response. And secondly, to detect the congruity, the match in the procedural qualities of the response, in the affect and the physiology of the other. Disposition that leads to what Peter Fonagy called psychic equivalence. That is, that seeks to generate an identity between what goes on in my brain and what goes on in the brain of the other. Matching that seems to evoke and activate this reward system, and I'm gonna go quickly here. So, psychic equivalence, this automatic disposition to generate an identity between my brain and the brain of the other, and vice versa, that seem to be connected to the activation of the mirror neurons, a system of neurons that seem in fact to document how we have evolved to put ourselves in other people's shoes and to get other people in our shoes. Others to feel what we feel and we to feel what others feel. That includes this automatic disposition to grasp, to activate our mirror neurons by first looking into people's eyes, which may be why we humans evolved this nice white sclera that turns our eyes into such a very good target, which is different, you see, from other primates who do not communicate their intentionality through their eyes, but through the movements of their whole head. Now, one of the problems with this automatic effort of psychic equivalence is that sometimes it doesn't work very well. This is a picture of that famous meeting that George Bush had with Vladimir Putin, in which he famously said that I looked at the man in the eyes and I caught a glimpse of his soul and I knew that I could trust him. I just want to point out to you the eyes that George Bush was. So without getting too distracted into a discussion about George Bush's mentalizing capabilities, normally evoking a match, see this capacity that my signal evokes a contingent match, and that's how I survive. It's the basis, perhaps, of the procedural sense of the self as an agent, which underlies the internal working model of the secure attachment of the self. I am effective because I survive, because I'm capable of evoking a responsive match from others. This is the prototype I propose to you. This is the evolutionary prototype of self-regulation or narcissistic regulation. Narcissistic from the standpoint that it involves the survival of the self. That I can turn around my states of distress and helplessness by my capacity to evoke a contingent, attuned, matching response from others. Conversely, the prototype of trauma is precisely when I'm not able to do what evolution had geared my brain to do, which is to be actively capable of evoking a matching response that ensures my survival. That is when I signal and nothing happens. when I'm passive and helpless in evoking a response, and I'm left passive and helpless. Which, not surprisingly, this lack of a contingent response, this is like Joe being left when he was crying while his mother will turn the shower on. This neglect as the prototype of trauma is a signal of threat to survival that automatically, see again, this is, we push a button and automatically comes a response. There's no flexibility or mediation. No contingency, automatic response of fight, freeze, or flight. An automatic defensive response. That involves that psychic equivalent that eliminates the uncertainty, because you see, the fundamental narcissistic vulnerability that we humans have is that we evolved to depend on others to pick up our signal and read that signal. Oh, honey, you're so hungry, and respond in a way that eliminates our distress and ensures our survival. And the thing is that we don't know when we send that signal if the others will accommodate to it or not. They'll be too distracted or not. They will take advantage of us or not. Or they will respond in a contingent, attuned, matching way. And psychic equivalence gives us that certainty by coercively seeking to evoke in the other exactly what is going on in me, eliminates that uncertainty and eliminates that vulnerability in a pretend kind of way, of course. So in the interest of time, I was going to get past this only to illustrate that under normal circumstances, most infants, this is following from 2 to 9, only to document in a time frame that corresponds with the maturation of mentalizing properly, the time when controlled and automatic mentalizing really achieve functional integration, when automatic physical aggression really drops very significantly, except for these guys here. And these guys here that maintain somewhat higher levels of aggressivity. So the point is, how do we go from automatic, you match me, I'm okay, down-regulate my brain, I don't get a match, automatic defensiveness, which may include aggression, may include anxiety, an effort to flee, may include freezing and dissociation. How do I go from that automatic defensive response to you match me or you don't match me, to a more flexible, context, goal, meaning-mediated response? How do we evolve? How do we acquire developmentally controlled mentalizing? Now, got actually very nice research that suggests that the average, as Winnicott called the good enough mother, is also bad enough mother, because the good enough mother, the good enough caretaker, gets right the signals of the baby about 1/3 of the time. It misses about 2/3 of the time, which seems to actually be pretty optimal for average babies, maybe not for all of them. But when she gets it, when the caretaker who persists, fails and keeps trying, keeps looking, stays open, stays inquisitive until he or she gets it. And when she gets it, communicates that not only with a contingent response, not only with an attuned response that is matching, not imitating the baby, not responding to the baby's crying with crying of her own, but responding in a way, oh honey, that captures the procedural, what Daniel Stern called the architecture of the response, the tone, the hedonic nature, the rhythm of that affect, and in addition, marks it. This marking, that in English we call that motherese, and I don't know what is the Portuguese equivalent for the oh honey, this exaggerated, slow down communication that caretakers automatically, intuitively deploy in responding to their babies. That involves a lot of eye contact, a lot of raising the eyebrows, that seems to be a way to uncouple, see, to shift, to mark something that uncouples the attention from the overt behavior to what may be behind the overt behavior, by suggesting, pay attention to what I'm doing now, because what I'm doing now is not me presenting my internal state. What I'm doing now is me representing my perspective on your internal state. Okay? I'm here playing with how your internal state looks like to me. Okay? Which looks like is a powerful epigenetic signal. So this attachment context that has that timing element of contingency, that attunement element of matching the affect, and that markedness that says, pay attention to this, look what I'm doing now, this is different. That seems to be the epigenetic stimuli that brings online structures of the brain like the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate that are capable of putting the brakes on the automatic inferior and posterior parts of the brain, going for psychic equivalence and automatic defensiveness, stop, 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 and are capable of shifting attention in a way that babies demonstrate when they're 9 months old, when they show you that pointing like this, that suggests that they know that what they see is not what you see. That what I have in my mind is not what is, it's just my perspective on things, which is different from yours, but I can influence you by pointing, look there, and then we can see the same thing. This is, I suggest, the beginning of representational processing. Capacity to, and here are the parts of the brain that come online, medial prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, that seem to work by creating a signal of trust that Peter Fonagy is going to talk more about in far more eloquent ways. But I only want to hear Mark, because this is the signal that says, put your defensiveness down. Hold on your defensiveness. Stop that automatic defensiveness. Tolerate not knowing and pay attention to what I'm teaching you. Pay attention to me and learn from me something that is going to be crucial for your survival. So the point here is that this context of attachment, this contingent, attuned, and marked context of attachment appears to be the epigenetic context that activates this powerful evolutionary mechanism that says, stop what you're doing, stop your defensiveness, and learn from this specific human being. And learn something that you're going to be able to apply. And that is going to allow you to, well, and I'm going to skip this, pay attention, that is going to be shared by everybody, and that will propose to you maybe really the crucial ingredient, the active mechanism by which psychotherapy works. That if psychotherapies work, they work because in all therapies, you see, we ask patients this extraordinarily hard thing. What we ask patients in all kinds of therapies is, when you get stressed, instead of automatically responding in the defensive way that you have learned to do, instead of doing that, stop. Try something different. Learn something different in this relationship. It's an incredibly hard thing to do. And it does require the activation of this component, without which we are not prepared to slow down our defensiveness and open ourselves to learning something new. This is Baron's Cohen notion about how we go from shared attention to these two systems which correspond. This is the automatic mentalizing that I've been talking about, this intuitive, empathizing, mirror neuron dependent system. And this is the controlled mentalizing, which Baron Cohen called the theory of mind mechanism, with these structures that I've been talking about, the medial prefrontal cortex in particular, which, as his schema suggests, as it begins to unfold around age 9 months, they really go side by side. Automatic mentalizing and controlled mentalizing really as parallel process, not really functionally integrated. When controlled mentalizing is not connected with the affective, intuitive aspect of a grasping state, emotional states, that's pretend. This is representation that doesn't really connect to something that feels for real. But it's the kind of processing that allows for play, that allows to look at things from multiple perspectives, to put things in context, to categorize, to bring together multiple concrete aspects of experience in something like the sense of self, in a way that gives me the sense that I'm not just the feelings of this moment, that there is more to me. There is a coherent sense of me that has some continuity over time. So, these two forms of processing that go side by side for a while until they get functionally integrated about age 4. At which point we can talk about mentalizing proper. But this functional integration is really designed to fail. These two components, and this is dissociation, this uncoupling happens normally as we turn on distress or as we go into attachment. But having that capacity gives us new means to create other ways of dealing with narcissistic vulnerability. They give us the representational capacities to deal with vulnerability. So instead of looking for a concrete match, we now look to generate a playful story, a narrative that fits. And we build that by creating some models of ourselves, not in the present, but in the future, something that I can try to approximate. Play is a lot of this negotiating how to put together different aspects of the self in the present and in the future and negotiate self-other relationships. So let me give you an example of this, how to deal with narcissistic vulnerability using representational means. Okay? So this is not the son who is going to graduate, but it's an older son who is, his name is Alex, and who he really never, having undoubtedly read Bowlby, he knew not to like to be left. So he hated when we would leave, and sensitive parents that we will tell him something like, oh, sweetie, I have to go to a meeting, but when you wake up, I'll be back, which was totally unsatisfactory, but that was like the best I could do. So one day I'm in the driveway of our house and I'm watching him, and he's driving his little black Porsche. It's a toy Porsche. His mother and I had been gone and we were feeling badly, so he ends up with this darn Porsche. So he's driving his little black Porsche up and down the driveway, and I'm watching him. So he says, Daddy, I'm going to a meeting. And I say, oh, great, Alex, have fun. And he looks at me and says, no, you idiot, you don't understand. Say, no, Daddy, cry. So I go, boo-hoo-hoo. And he says, okay, Daddy, when you wake up, I'll be back. So turning around, you see, the state of vulnerability by creating some model that is built on memories, the model that we have provided, some fantasies of his own. Now this, I'm going to skip this part about the evolutionary model, but it's really meant to illustrate this part that really mentalizing may have evolved as actually a safety signaling mechanism, as a mechanism that gave us the representational means to anticipate and to influence in an adaptive way the course of attachment interactions. That is, the regulator through representational means of this crucial decision: who do I trust? When do I trust? How much do I trust? Who do I trust now and let in, put my guard down and learn from, and who I don't trust and put my guard up and go in a defensive mode and put some distance? Because, as Ian McEwan suggested, the key, the trick to human success is to be selective. He said, in your mercies, I'll propose to you that the key may be to be selective in your trust. So these three systems, the defensive system, the attachment system, the mentalizing system, function in a loosely coupled manner. When one is prominently activated, the others are partially turned off. So, and there is a lot of interesting research that shows actually how that works and how actually mentalizing and this social judgment, can I trust or not trust, actually gets turned off when we go into attachment. Right? As you can see by, when we go into attachment, this is the intensity of activation in the caudate. And I'll leave it at that. The point of it being that mentalizing involves this balancing act, this decision to, okay, so I'm mentalizing, so I decide I can go into attachment. until I turn it off, I return, or I need to go in a defensive mode, and then I turn it off, return to mentalizing. This balancing that allows this, what Jeremy Holmes called the psychoimmune mechanism. There's mentalizing as a psychologically immune mechanism that tells us who do I get in and who do I let in and who I don't. As well as the mechanism that, just like the biological immunological system, initiates the repair process. So holding the balance between psychic equivalence and representational pretend is the key. Balance that becomes rather difficult to achieve during adolescence, when this is not to depress you, but this is to show that the thickness of the cortex reaches its peak at age 12, and then it's downhill afterwards. But what this reflects really is that during adolescence, there's a very active process of generating new synaptic connections, followed by pruning. It's a lot of pruning that happens in specifically the parts of the brain that are involved with controlled mentalizing. Okay? Very specifically in those parts of the brain. This is similar to what happens between age 1 and age 11 in the circuits of the brain involved with language that go through a similar process of synaptic formation and pruning, including as well the coding of the axons with myelin that makes them very efficient. Those who have been used, this is experience-dependent process. This is the use it or lose it principle of brain pruning and brain development. But in addition, during adolescence, sexual hormones increase the density and the reactivity of the oxytocin receptors. So there is a greater proneness to respond more intensely, to prime the organism as it's evolutionary proper for mating, for attachment. So there is greater responsiveness and sensitivity to attachment cues. So we got an imbalance between representational controlled mentalizing, which is undergoing this transformation, and the more intense automatic mentalizing that is ready for responding to matching or unmatching. That's the imbalance. So actually one hypothesis is that adolescence may well have evolved, and this may be the reason why adolescence is getting longer and longer, as social networks get increasingly more complex and more abstract. Then the process of adolescence seems to be extending, now into the mid to late 20s, if not 30s. So it's a longer process of time during which we're going to create specific networks to regulate who do we trust and who don't we trust, and how do we regulate social interactions in very complex environments where now we interact with hundreds of thousands of people through the internet, if not millions or billions. While that is happening, adolescents are not good at that functional integration, that balancing act. By the way, I was talking earlier about attachment being cued by fear. But it may be that there are some people who really are limited in their capacity to experience fear and vulnerability. And there may be a biological basis for that. Maybe the folks who are the callous and unemotional true psychopaths, who really are blind, as they miss that capacity, they don't initiate the process that leads us to learn to recognize some aspects of our experience as well as the experience of others. Our colleague Essie Viding talks about interviewing adolescents in a facility for adolescent murderers. And she shows this picture to one adolescent, and the question is, what is this person feeling? And he looks at, oh, wait, she looks the way people do before I knife them. Right? So a specific blindness to fear, to vulnerability, to pain. But when shown pictures like that, adults, you see, have less response of the amygdala compared to adolescents. But adults are also more capable of recruiting the controlled mentalizing aspects of the brain compared to adolescents. So I brought this picture from my high school reunion. So this is the problem of adolescence, a time of particular vulnerability for those who come into adolescence with pre-existing difficulties and a pre-existing vulnerability to the breakdown of mentalizing, to the emergence of this cluster of emerging personality disorders. And in the interest of time, let me just go very quickly. To go to a maladaptive antisocial narcissistic process of dealing with vulnerability of trust that involves, that is that state of being vulnerable that is not being represented and mentalized, that in the presence of which, just like Joe's, I was trying to illustrate, responds with an intense defensive reaction to that state of feeling vulnerable and that state of wanting to initiate attachment. So in the face of which there is an inhibition of mentalization and a disconnect of vulnerability. So this is this pretend state in which I'm not vulnerable because I make you feel vulnerable. The vulnerability is here, is not here. And I'm not feeling this. I'm really in control. I'm really powerful. I'm really not afraid. I'm not vulnerable. You are. That includes the psychic equivalent need to evoke in the other the fear, the vulnerability that I feel and that I can't stand in me. Now, this effort to evoke coercively those states of vulnerability actually evokes loss of mentalizing in others. So I want to spend my last 10 minutes just talking about what MBT seeks to do with this, which is fundamentally to slow down these efforts in which non-mentalizing evokes non-mentalizing in other family members, in teachers, in therapists, in probation officers, even judges, I think. So the effort of the treatment is first to shift these cycles in which they're non-mentalized. I made the comment that when he tells me about how he's going to rape my wife and burn my house and murder my children, that's not really good for one's mentalizing. Actually, we turn off our own mentalizing automatically. This may be an evolutionary response because we recognize that when somebody approaches us in a mentalizing mode, they're not going to kill us. They're relatively safe. But when somebody approaches me in a non-mentalizing way, I turn on mentalizing and go in automatic defensive mode, but respond therefore in a coercive way that reinforces the non-mentalizing. So the first goal is to interrupt that, to interrupt those coercive cycles, to shift from non-mentalizing to mentalizing conversations, to provide targeted treatment, because often there are many neuropsychiatric problems, from attention deficit, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, that both make mentalizing more difficult and are made worse by the loss of mentalizing. And promote epistemic trust and mentalizing in general, particularly in the context, in the specific context in which it breaks down, in order to initiate cycles of trust and learning where coercion and mentalizing keep repeating the same pattern. So the elements of mentalizing: first, slow down coercion. Recruit the young person's attachment context in an effort to exchange coercive interactions that foster defensiveness and turn them into mentalizing conversations. To create in all contexts, in individual, group, and family, the kind of connection that is engaged, that is open, that is interested, that promotes epistemic trust. It's a fundamental principle, is looking to promote that element of trust, but we do so with the need to calibrate, because for kids like Joe, it's the activation of attachment precisely what turns them into a defensive response. So we need to carefully calibrate how much attachment and mentalizing demands we're going to make on them that don't elicit too much defensive responses. And paying particular attention to what I refer to as the therapeutic bargain. That is, the appreciation that it takes an enormous amount of courage to communicate that we recognize that it's an enormous risk, actually, for somebody like Joe to actually take the risk, to put his guard down when he feels vulnerable, and at that very moment do what otherwise he would never do, which is to trust. Because it does take a lot of courage to engage in treatment. But this, we think, provides a little path that we've found that allows really to help adolescents break the grip that otherwise mistrust has placed on their anger and their loneliness. Thank you very much.